Hi, my name is Patricia White, and I'm one of the editors of Camera Obscura, a journal that's published through Duke University Press. And I'm delighted to be here with the author of Unseeing Empire, Photography, Representation, and South Asian America, Bakirathi. Welcome, Baki.
I'm so excited to be part of this conversation, to think about representation and visual culture and race with the winning election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the first Black woman and first Asian American woman to become vice president.
So, Baki, let's talk about your book. The scope of your book is, in some ways, very specific. You talk about three incredibly talented and interesting fine art photographers, but you do it in a broader context of South Asian America, a term that you use in your first book, Aspiring to Home. And I want you to explain a little bit what the big project is of your book.
Sure. Well, the book is really centered in one question, which is, what does it mean for South Asian American immigrants to identify with visual representations of themselves? That's a specific question, but I'm much more broadly interested in the relationship between race and representation, between the viewer and the artwork, between the artwork and the exhibition spaces in which we see these kinds of examples of fine art photography. The book is centered, as you know, on three amazing South Asian women artists, Gauri Gill, Mathew, and Seher Shah. But I am looking at their art in a much broader social context in order to think about the ways in which immigrants, including myself, come to see and identify with representations of ourselves. So really, the questions that animate this book are about what does it mean for racialized immigrants to see representations of race in popular culture? What does it mean for immigrants to claim and identify with these images, but also what happens when these images don't represent us, right? How is photography in particular an aesthetic form that enables us to feel represented because of its mimetic quality? But in what ways might photography also carry with it this longer 19th and 20th century history of empire, insofar as photography has been used consistently as a tool to document and surveil immigrants of color.
Mm-hmm. And are you thinking of that in a colonial context on the subcontinent, but also in the U.S. context?
That's right. A number of the artists that I am working with in this book are artists, well, in fact, they're all artists who are widely exhibited globally, both in South Asia and across North America, in Europe and Australia. And what I am trying to do in this book is to pull together the various histories of the artworks themselves, which are all contemporary artworks, but they all reference archival photography in a variety of different ways. The archival photographs that they reference come from 19th century British colonial India, from 20th century settler colonial America, from mid-20th century formations of US empire in the Pacific, and so on. So there are all these various histories, photographic histories, that come alive through these artists' works. And the artists themselves reproduce, deploy, or alter these archival photographs in their artworks in a variety of different ways. So that's one set of things that is happening. But the other set of things that's happening and that I am tracing in this book is, how do viewers come to engage with these photographic images? What do they see when they see these artworks? How does it make them feel? And in what ways do we claim to see ourselves in both contemporary and archival images that have very complex histories of racial representation?
One thing that you do in the book is that you use yourself as an example, and you've said "we" in our exchange already, and I want you to say a little bit more about that method, but also about how you understand the sense of community in diaspora in South Asian America.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a interesting question. I have put myself kind of at the center of this book in a way, because for me, the questions of how immigrants, South Asian American immigrants, relate to ideas of race and representations is an enormously personal question. I am I am someone who has become South Asian American in the 20 odd years that I have lived in the United States. And so for me, the construct of South Asian America is very much a construct that comes alive through senses of community, through a collective sense. So a collective we, throughout the book, not just to reference South Asian Americans like myself. I don't, for example, believe that there's a single unitary concept of what it means to be South Asian American, and that's something that I've written about in my previous book, Aspiring to Home. But what I do believe is that acts of viewership are collective social work. And I believe that the ways in which we identify with visual representations of ourselves, particularly in community-oriented spaces like exhibitions and so on, are places where we are identifying with the artworks that we see, but we're also identifying with each other, and we're kind of claiming kinship to strangers in these spaces of exhibition, who may be South Asian American, but who may also be Black or Asian American or Latinx. And so it is a really collective project of trying to imagine ourselves as visually represented in the public sphere, right? And so my use of a collective we, as well as grounding this book through my own personal experience, is something that's very much vested in a collective imagination and a collective representation of community.
Can you say a little bit more about the theories that inform that? You've just spoken to the, really personal, affective stakes of belonging, but you've also marshaled a lot of really interesting, quite recent work.
So, for example, within contemporary Black feminist visual studies scholarship, there's been a number of theorists, amongst them Tina Kempt and Nicole Fleetwood or Kimberly Brown, who have looked at a variety of different archival material of photography. So, again, from the 19th century through the present, photojournalism, fine art, and family portraits. And they have taught taught us how do we create a narrative of selfhood and community through the photographs that we see, right? But queer of color scholars have also been really central to this project, because scholars like Gayatri Gopinath, for example, have written about a wide range of visual art forms, but have also shown us how intimately racialized subjects identify with representations of themselves, even when those representations are not quite representations of them, right? So we might see an artwork that we think represents us, but we know in the act of seeing that the artwork that we're engaging with is not actually us. Yet we're sort of wrapping our arms around it and claiming it as a representation of ourselves.
You call that diasporic mimesis.
I do. Yeah, I develop a theory of what I call diasporic mimesis in order to explicate that mimetic relationship of identity that diasporic viewers generate in relation to the aesthetic object. And what I'm trying to show through my use of diasporic mimesis is that the pool of identification is so strong, and it feels so real because we want to see ourselves represented, right? And so how does that happen?
So can we turn back to the practices of these photographers who are engaging with that desire, but are actually engaging, as you said, with much longer histories of photographic representation, and are in fact thwarting that desire to be represented. Right. So could you describe a little bit the way that these three artists deconstruct?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the three artists, Seher Shah, Anu Mathew, and Gauri Gill, are really, their work is really at the heart of this project. And it's been such a privilege for me to work alongside these artists and see how their artworks have circulated over the decade that it took to write this book. So I'll sort of talk about each artist in turn, because I think that each one of their practices deserves to be highlighted. So Seher Shah's artwork is the one that really opens out this book. She's trained as an architect, and she's known for her sculpture as well as for her drawings. And in the first chapter of my book, I write about an enormously large-scale drawing that she's produced. And the cover of my book is also from Seher Shah, and this is one of her other wonderful artwork.
Beautiful work.
Yeah, thanks.
It's black and white.
That's right. And the drawing that I write about, Geometric Landscapes and the Spectacle of Force, is also a black and white drawing. It's hand-drawn, but within that drawing, Shah incorporates archival photographs of the 1903 and 1911 Delhi Darbars, which were the spectacular imperial ceremonies that the British held in India in the early 20th century to formalize the transfer of India to the crown. And so these are archival photographs that Shah sourced from the British Library, right? And I think it's really interesting to think about the routes through which Shah, as a Pakistani artist, who's now based in Delhi, had to go to London to find the photographs that commemorate this kind of early 20th century.
And it was about like a handover. So in a way, it's like the visual trace of that,
That's right. Yeah. And so she has taken the series of archival images within this large-scale drawing, and she's used the reverse negative print of these photographs across the horizontal length of her drawing. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about Shah's work is how she deploys this photograph multiple times as a reverse negative print, as a kind of ghostly or haunting presence within her own drawing. And in so doing, she's both disseminating the scene of empire, right? But she's also making us aware of its visual effect. And in the chapter, I talk about my experience of seeing the drawing for the first time at a gallery in New Delhi in 2009, and then beginning to see the same drawing over time in the artist studio in New York and in the confines of my own computer here in Philadelphia. And over the time that I engaged with the drawing, I realized that it was a drawing that was, for me in any case, not just telling a story about empire in South Asia, but also telling a story about the more recent expansion of U.S. empire on the subcontinent, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11. So for me, Geometric Landscapes and the Spectacle of Force is a drawing that really brings to life how South Asian American viewers are engaging with visual representations of themselves that bring alive multiple forms of empire at the same time.
So can you tell me a little bit more about Anu Mathew's work, which does engage with portraiture, which is a much more direct practice of representation?
Yeah, I think you're right, Patty, that the book opens out with these abstract representations in Shah's drawing and then moves into what we might consider to be more mimetic forms of representation in photography. And the second artist that I write about is Anu Palakonathu Mathew, whose work actually I write about intermittently throughout the project. But I focus in a chapter on her series, which is titled An Indian from India. And it's a series of diptychs in which Mathew reproduces on the left side of the diptych Edward Curtis's elegiac photographs of native peoples, which were taken in the early decades of the 20th century. And then she puts on the right side of the diptych a self-portrait of herself, also in black and white, where she mimics the style and pose of Curtis's protagonists. And one of the things that I find spellbinding, really, about An Indian from India are the kinds of narratives of selfhood and empire that are evoked by these diptychs. So what I've tried to do in my writing on Mathew's work is to think about An Indian from India not simply as a linear narrative of immigrant subjects taking the place of or literally overshadowing the indigenous subjects who are in Curtis's prints, but rather to think about the asymmetrical relations of power that are embodied by the two subjects of the diptych, and then to step outside the framework of the diptych to think about what other histories of ethnographic portraiture are evoked by An Indian from India. So, for example, Edward Curtis's portraits from the early 20th century, I argue, are deeply indebted to British colonial ethnographic portraits of Indians in India that were taken in the late 19th century, both in terms of their style, in their form, as well as in their mass dissemination. And so for myself as a South Asian diasporic subject looking at Mathew's prints, I am so compelled by how, in seeing a relationship between settler colonial portraiture on the one hand and contemporary diasporic portraiture on the other, what we're actually seeing is this much longer and equally powerful history of colonial representation that comes from another continent, right? And that is filtered through this seemingly American story of Mathew's, an Indian from India. And I just want to say that what has helped me to make that argument has been the tremendous scholarship of indigenous and feminist theorists of visual culture, as well as a number of indigenous photographers who have themselves worked with Curtis's prints and have reformatted them or altered them in a variety of ways to make a critique of specifically the ethnographic narrative that he's trying to produce through his prints.
So it does seem like these works, which are all made, all of the artists that you're working on are 21st century bodies of work. So there does seem to be a connection between defining South Asians in relationship to American identity post 9/11. So could you speak a little bit to how the kind of the new renewed visual focus on South Asian as potential threats to American identity kind of fed into the practice of these artists, but also to the reception of their work by South Asian American
Sure. Yeah,
viewers.
and I think that's a really great question, and I think I can speak to that with particular reference to the third and last artist that I discuss in this book, whose name is Gauri Gill, and Gill is a very widely known documentary photographer based in New Delhi. She's most well known for her documentary photographs of India and of Indians in India. And she has worked extensively over the last 20 years or so with indigenous communities in rural and urban India, as well as other marginalized religious and social groups. But I am looking actually at an early body of photography that she produced in 2008 to 9, and it's called The Americans. And that series is a riff, in my view, to Robert Frank, exactly, to Robert Frank's 1958 canonical series, The Americans. But in Gill's series, what she's done is that she's traveled across the United States from West Coast to East Coast, across the South, to take photographs of South Asian immigrants who are an enormously, as we know, enormously heterogeneous community, right? So the Gill's Americans has portraits and snapshots of South Asian Americans who are construction workers, factory workers, restaurant shift workers, as well as lobbyists in Capitol Hill, tech entrepreneurs, fine art collectors. So it's a extremely diverse series of portraits that she's named to the Americans. And I talk about the individual images themselves, which I think are so fascinating because in so many instances in her photographs, she doesn't quite focus just on the immigrant subject, but on the spaces that they occupy. And I talk in the book about how if we follow the very geometrically organized lines of her photographic images, we actually see all these narratives that are not just about like the immigrant themselves. I also situate Gill's Americans within the context of exhibition display, as I do for the other artists as well. Gill's Americans was widely exhibited in metropolitan cities across India, in North America, in Canada, and as well as across the United States. And one of the things that I found so fascinating, I went to see Gill's Americans first in New York City when it was exhibited there. And what I found so compelling were the ways in which viewers who came to that gallery show claimed that they were the Americans, that they claimed to see themselves in the images, even when, of course, they were not actually in these photographs, right? So why is it that South Asian Americans who came to the gallery, and again, these were middle and upper middle class South Asians for the most part, were identifying with this very heterogeneous set of images of South Asians from across the country and claiming to see themselves in these images? And so I thought about how, what are the sort of affective ways in which South Asians see themselves as Americans? And how much do we hold on to the visual image, and particularly the photographs, to tell us that we belong here, right? And what kinds of communities do we create in spaces like these galleries where we can really feel, that sense of belonging?
And there must be some irony in Gauri Gill's title and in her mise en scène and in the way she's staging this question of belonging in a country that's not been very friendly to immigrants, especially lately.
At all. I mean, which is enormously, it has been enormously hostile throughout its history for people of color. And this reminds me, Patty, of what you were asking in terms of the representation of South Asians after 9/11, right? And so one of the things that I argue in relation to Gill's work is that the apparatus of documentary photography is, for me, very akin to this colonial, the use of ethnographic portraiture in 19th and early 20th century colonial India, right? So there are these ways in which I think documentary photography is meant to produce the truth of its subject, right? And ethnographic portraiture is also meant to elicit a kind of truth of its subject. But what happens when the photographer refuses to create in the photographic image a kind of truth, a reflection? Exactly. What happens when the photographer's technique of documentary photography rejects the premise of the photograph being a truth-telling object, right? Then what we get is a method of making visual representations that rejects that history of surveillance that is so embedded in documentary photography, and actually that history of surveillance, which is so central to how South Asian Americans are viewed now, right? And so I am really just in awe of how Gill, but also how Mathew and Shah are, all three of them really across the board, rejecting the premise of the photograph as an object of truth, right? Even when diasporic subjects are approaching the photograph as if it's an object of truth, right?
I'm always struck as a film scholar that people want to see themselves in films and therefore demand like a superhero of a particular race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality. And so is that really yourself, or is that some other fantasy?
Right. And I think that, one of the threads that's really running across this book is how much we, and again, by we, I mean racialized subjects and South Asian Americans in particular, how much we desire to see our own representation. Right? It's a kind of obsessive desire. I am very much a part of that desire. I always want to see like more South Asian American representation, and certainly more people of color representation in public culture. But I'm also really curious about where that desire comes from and whether the desire to see ourselves can ever be fully satisfied, right?
Let me ask, just given the election, how Kamala Harris is then seen as a representative, like an elected representative of the people, and how you think the visual politics of Kamala might fit into some of the ideas that you... I'm thinking of particularly of family photographs of her mother and growing up.
Yes, and I think, Kamala Harris's rise as now the Vice President of the United States, or Vice President-elect of the United States, happened after I completed the book. But certainly when she announced her candidacy initially for President of the United States, I was overwhelmed by the amount of archival family photographs that flooded the news media that were about Kamala Harris's childhood, right? And I was overwhelmed by them for a couple of reasons. I think Harris, who is well aware of her historical significance as a Black woman, as a South Asian woman, as a child of immigrants, as a graduate of a historically Black university, she's well aware of the fact that she can invite so many people to identify with her, right? And her campaign is actually premised on that. It's premised on the fact that we see her and we acknowledge her as one of our own, despite how very different we might be. And here, again, the we is really heterogeneous, right? So, but so many people from so many different pathways look at Harris and think, that's me, or that could be me. One of the reasons why I have felt that in relation to looking at Harris is because of her family photographs. These are images, Polaroid photographs and photographs that were taken by close friends that you can find really if you do any kind of online search for Kamala Harris, which document her in relation to her mother and her sister. And there are also some photographs that show Kamala Harris with her grandparents in what is now Chennai, in the state of Tamil Nadu in India. My family, my parents are from, I should say not just my parents, but my great-grandparents are from the same region of India that Kamala Harris's grandparents are from. And so when I look at these family photographs, I am so compelled by the way that her grandmother ties her sari, the way that Kamala Harris and her sister Maya Harris are also wearing saris, are wearing jewelry to kind of perform a certain kind of Indianness when they're in their grandparents' house. And they're so happy, it looks like they're very happy to be there with their grandparents, but they're also very awkward in how they're wearing their saris. And of course, that immediately elicits my own awkwardness when I traveled back to India. When I traveled back to India, from Japan as a young girl, and I was delighted to see my family, but I also was wearing clothes that I wouldn't normally wear. I'm so moved by the number of images that show Kamala Harris with her mother, and I really wish that her mother was here to see her today. I think seeing her mother and Kamala Harris together reminds me a lot of my own close relationship with my mother. And these are the kinds of intimate relationships that are enshrined in photography, right? And when we are apart from or lose the people who are dearest to us, we look at these photographs as proof that they existed and that we existed in these relationships with them. So, I want to emphasize that across this project, in as much as I'm critiquing the project of representation, I'm so compelled by the desire to be represented and the desire to see ourselves, not just in the world at large, but also in our private everyday lives. And photography is like an object that's a conduit, right? It can be fine art photography in a gallery space, or it can be like a Polaroid snapshot in a shoebox in your basement, right? And they're all really equally interesting ways of trying to see yourself.
No, and I was really struck by that because you can think of these artists as having, deflected certain colonial surveillance, taxonomic, evidentiary modes through very deliberate aesthetic strategies that you read closely in your book, but then also the family photo as another way of deflecting a sort of state or colonial projection of what someone should look like.
Yeah, can I talk about that for a moment, Patty, if that's okay with you? Because in some ways, this book actually began with something that I thought was a family photograph, and it turned out it wasn't, right? So the book actually began in 2005 when I was still writing Aspiring to Home. And in 2005, again, this is just 4 years after 9/11, and it was during the time of the special registration of Muslim American men in particular, including South Asian men. There was a real kind of demonization of South Asians and Muslim Americans in U.S. popular culture. I used the word there was, but of course it's continuing today. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was this amazing exhibition at the Queens Museum in New York called Fatal Love, South Asian American Art Now. And I went to see this exhibition, and one of the first works that I encountered was Mathew's Fabricated Memories. And that is it's a series of family photographs that are folded in an accordion-shaped book and that were nestled in a vitrine that was filled with tobacco. And it's a series of family photographs that show whom I presume was the artist, Mathew herself, embraced by her parents on a carousel ride with her father, just these really lovely photos of a family. And I thought, oh, isn't that nice? And I kind of walked away, and I thought,
Walked away from something called fabricated
memories, thinking that this is actually her life. And 10 years later, in 2015, I saw the same work at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. And that was when I realized, I had obviously not paid attention to the title, right? Because that was when I realized that, in fact, these photographs were fabricated, that they were created out of, in part, the artist's family archive, but they were created as a kind of elegy for her father, who passed away when she was 11 years old. And so it's not a family album so much as it is a narrative of loss and a narrative of a family being haunted, right?
And the tobacco leaves because
her father died of smoking-related illnesses. And Mathew was born in England and raised there in her childhood, but she moved to Bangalore, India when she was 11 years old, and her father passed away shortly thereafter. So it was a real rupture in so many ways, right? So it made me think so much about how I, as a viewer, attached myself to that aesthetic object, and I thought, in some ways, I saw myself represented. But then 10 years later, I saw the same object again, and I realized, oh, this is a project that's actually making me relook at the photograph. It's telling me that the photograph is not an object that can be so easily read, and it's not an object that we can attach to so easily. There's so much more going on in this image, right?
And it brings it back to that question, or the characteristic, ontological property of the photograph is that it is about something that's lost. And that, I think you have a lovely quote in your book from Lisa Lowe about how photographs
are objects of cathexis and displacement, right? And I'm deeply indebted to Lowe's scholarship in so many ways, but that was actually something that she said when she came to Swarthmore and gave a talk on the state of the archives. But I think a lot about the photograph as an object of cathexis and displacement, and so many Black feminist visual critics have also written about this. But the photograph is really for racialized immigrants, for diasporic subjects, the photograph is the closest thing that you're going to get to an archival document of yourself, right? Because our histories are not enshrined in national. They're not enshrined in national archives, in municipal offices, in, they are stuffed in shoeboxes, right? They are lovingly framed in family albums, right?
The Mathew story of the two different exhibits that you went to brings me to a question I wanted to ask you about curation, because I had the privilege of seeing Anu Mathew's Fabricated Memories, because you curated a show here in Philadelphia. So can you talk a little bit about, which I think is also an intervention in these image making, these public cultures around image making. And so if you could say a little bit about that part of your method, which again brings your project a little bit out of sort of an art historical, aesthetic appreciation of this work to a more ethnographic or socially embedded, practice-based critique. And if you could say a little bit more about the show you curated and that work.
Sure, yeah. So in 2015, I curated a show in Philadelphia called Ruins and Fabrications, and it was at 12 Gates Gallery in downtown Philadelphia. That show, I curated that show at the outset of writing this manuscript. And at the time I thought, oh, I'm going to put my manuscript in a gallery. I'm going to make my manuscript come alive by bringing a couple of the artists, Mathew and Gill, whom I write about, into the gallery space, and I can arrange their artworks, not the artworks that I write about in the book, but other artworks that they have created. I can arrange their artworks in such a way as to visualize the narrative of my book. But what I realized, and I think this is a power of viewer engagement, and the really interesting thing about curation is that, unlike being a critic of photography, you have no control over how people are looking and engaging with these objects, right? And so across the book, I use curation as a method to think about how objects narrate to each other in space, how viewers negotiate the spaces in which the objects are displayed, and what kinds of meanings do they make out of it. I also think about curation, to curate is to care for the aesthetic object. But one of the things that I think curation does is that it cares for the spirit of community that emerges out of these exhibition spaces. And so I trained as a curator in order to complete this project in a way. It was my research. I trained as a curator also to understand the vocabulary, the spatial vocabularies through which artworks gain meanings. But what I didn't anticipate was how much pivoting between the role of the critic and the curator would open me up to these completely unexpected modes of identification that viewers created with the art objects that they saw, the ways in which viewers rejected some of the visual images that they were seeing, but also how they made sense of their own alienation from those images. And so I saw all of that in Ruins and Fabrications when I curated that show on opening night and in some of the public forums that followed. But I have also written more extensively about curatorial projects in the book in relation to the Smithsonian exhibition Beyond Bollywood, which was also held in 2014 to 2015.
Thank you so much. I want to congratulate you on the publication of this book, and it will get out there in the world despite the strangeness of 2020 and having an outdoor interview with lots of neighborhood sounds.
It's been such a pleasure. I'm so glad that we could do this together. And I just wanted to say how grateful I am that we could have this conversation in person, and how grateful I am also to have you as a colleague and a friend at Swarthmore. So thank you so much, Patty.